On the afternoon of the 24th of November, 1971, Northwest Orient Flight 305 lifted off from Portland, Oregon, bound for Seattle. It was the day before Thanksgiving. Most of the 36 passengers aboard were thinking about family dinners, football games, the short hop north. One man was not. He sat in the rear of the Boeing 727, wearing a dark suit and a black tie, a briefcase resting on his knees. He had boarded using the name Dan Cooper. He had paid cash for his ticket, and somewhere over the rain-soaked forests of the Pacific Northwest, he would do something no hijacker in American history had ever done before or has done since. Who was Dan Cooper? Where did he go? And why? More than 50 years later, does the FBI still not know? The early 1970s were a turbulent period in American life. The optimism of the post-war boom had curdled into something harder, more suspicious. The Vietnam War ground on with no clear end in sight. The Watergate scandal was beginning its slow boil. Inflation was eroding the savings of ordinary Americans. Unemployment had ticked upward through 1971, and a general unease had settled into the national mood. People felt that institutions, government, law enforcement, the military, had been lying to them. That cynicism found expression in pop culture, in politics, and, occasionally, in crime. Aviation itself was a relatively young industry in 1971. Commercial air travel had only become widespread in the previous decade. The Boeing 727 had entered service in 1964, and it had a particular design feature that would prove fateful in this case: a rear air stair that could be opened and deployed in flight. Airport security in this era was largely theoretical. The Transportation Security Administration did not yet exist. Passengers walked to their gates without passing through metal detectors. Carry-on bags were not screened. A man with a briefcase and a calm demeanor could board any flight in America without scrutiny. Hijackings were not uncommon in this period. Between 1968 and 1972, there were more than 130 hijacking attempts on American airlines, most of them demanding passage to Cuba. They had become, in an almost grim way, routine. Airline crews received training on how to negotiate, how to stay calm, how to give hijackers what they wanted in order to get passengers safely on the ground. That training would be tested on the 24th of November in ways no manual had anticipated. The man who called himself Dan Cooper purchased his one-way ticket at the Portland International Airport counter. He was described by flight attendants and passengers as a middle-aged man, somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with dark hair, olive or tan complexion, and dark eyes. He wore a dark business suit, a black tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and a white dress shirt. He carried a black briefcase and a paper bag. He was described as polite, soft-spoken, and unremarkable. He ordered a bourbon and soda and paid for it. He did not stand out. That, investigators would later conclude, was entirely intentional. Shortly after takeoff, he passed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, who was seated nearby. She assumed it was the kind of note businessmen occasionally pass to stewardesses, an unwanted advance, and tucked it in her purse without reading it. He leaned toward her and said, quietly but clearly, that she ought to look at it. She did. The note stated that he had a bomb. He opened his briefcase briefly, allowing her to see what appeared to be red cylindrical sticks, wires, and a battery. She could not determine whether it was a real device or a convincing fabrication. She did not wait to find out. She relayed the information to the cockpit, and the pilots notified authorities on the ground. Cooper's demands were specific and, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily detailed. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. He wanted a fuel truck, ready in Seattle, to refuel the plane. And he wanted the money and parachutes delivered to the aircraft when it landed. In exchange, he would release the passengers. He was methodical. He was patient. He waited. The aircraft landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport at approximately 5:45 in the evening. FBI agents and Seattle police surrounded the plane, but maintained distance, following protocol to avoid provoking the hijacker. Northwest Orient Airlines and the FBI made the decision to comply. The $200,000 was assembled from bank reserves, 4 packets of mixed, mostly used $20 bills, the serial numbers of which were photographed and recorded before delivery. The 4 parachutes were provided by a local skydiving school. A Northwest Airlines employee carried the money and chutes to the plane in a duffel bag. Cooper allowed the passengers to deplane once the ransom was delivered. He kept the crew, pilot William Scott, First Officer Robert Rataksak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tena Mucklow. He instructed the pilots to fly toward Mexico City at the lowest possible airspeed, below 150 knots, and at an altitude of no more than 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the flaps set at 15 degrees. The configuration would slow the aircraft dramatically. The pilots explained that these conditions would make reaching Mexico City without refueling impossible. Cooper agreed to stop in Reno, Nevada. At approximately 7:40 in the evening, somewhere over the dense evergreen wilderness of southwestern Washington or northern Oregon, the crew felt a pressure change. Tena Mucklow, the only flight attendant who remained in the cabin with Cooper, reported that at approximately 8:13 p.m., the aft air stair warning light illuminated on the cockpit instrument panel. The stairs had been lowered. Minutes later, the crew felt a shift in the aircraft's tail section. Dan Cooper was gone. The plane landed in Reno without incident. At 10:15 p.m., the cabin was empty. The rear air stair was still extended. A black tie and a mother of pearl clip lay on a seat in the rear of the aircraft. Most of the 4 parachutes remained. 2 were missing. The search began immediately. The FBI organized one of the largest manhunts in Pacific Northwest history. Army troops, National Guard units, sheriff's deputies, and FBI agents combed the remote wilderness south of the flight path. Military aircraft flew low over the Cascade foothills and the Columbia River Valley. Search teams worked through the cold November rain. They found nothing. The terrain was brutal: dense second-growth forest, steep ravines, logging roads that ended abruptly in wilderness. A man could disappear there forever. The investigation that followed was designated NORJAK, for Northwest Hijacking, and it would become the longest-running active investigation in FBI history. In the weeks after the jump, agents worked to narrow the drop zone. Using radar data, wind speed records, and the aircraft's speed and heading, analysts calculated a probable landing area somewhere between the town of Ariel, Washington, and the Lewis River. The calculation was imprecise. The area was vast, and it had been raining since before Cooper jumped. The FBI's forensic capabilities in 1971 were substantial for the era but severely limited by modern standards. There was no DNA analysis. That technique would not exist for another 15 years. There were no computerized databases for fingerprint matching. Fingerprint evidence from the aircraft was collected, but the plane had been in commercial service for hours before the hijacking, and distinguishing Cooper's C prints from those of other passengers proved impossible. A partial palm print was recovered from the aft air stair, but it could not be definitively matched to any individual in law enforcement records. The FBI did have the serial numbers of all 10,000 bills in the ransom, 244 packets of used 20s, Agents distributed the list to banks, casinos, and currency exchanges across the country. The bills were never spent. Not one turned up in circulation, which meant either that Cooper had hidden the money perfectly, died in the jump, or both. Contemporary newspapers seized on the story with an enthusiasm bordering on glee. The Seattle Post, Intelligencer, ran the headline, "Hijacker gets $200,000, parachutes from jet," the morning after the incident. The story made front pages across the country. Television news programs devoted segments to speculation about Cooper's identity and fate. Within days, a kind of folk mythology had begun to form around the unknown man. He was portrayed in newspapers, in barrooms, at Thanksgiving dinner tables across the Pacific Northwest, as a daring outlaw in the tradition of Jesse James or Butch Cassidy. A man who had taken on the airlines, the FBI, and the federal government, and seemingly gotten away with it. The name D.B. Cooper, a conflation stemming from a miscommunication between a wire service reporter and a local Oregon suspect named D.B. Cooper, who was quickly cleared, stuck in the public imagination and never left. The romanticization was uncomfortable for investigators and victims, advocates alike. Cooper had committed a federal crime, endangered the lives of a crew, and traumatized the flight attendants who had spent hours in his presence. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow gave detailed statements and cooperated fully with the investigation. Both described a man who was calm, controlled, and apparently experienced. He knew what the 727's air stair could do. He knew how parachutes worked. He asked about the chute configuration and appeared comfortable with the equipment. The FBI's behavioral analysts concluded that he had likely had some military training, possibly airborne or special operations, and may have had experience with the Pacific Northwest terrain. The physical evidence was sparse but carefully catalogued. The 2 parachutes that remained in the cabin provided some information. Cooper had taken 1 primary and 1 reserve chute. Crucially, one of the reserves he left behind was a dummy training chute, non-functional, sewn shut. Investigators debated what this meant. Had he knowingly selected a functional primary, or had he taken a non-functional reserve by mistake? If he jumped with a training reserve, he would have had no backup if his primary failed. The FBI's parachute experts examined the remaining chutes and offered conflicting assessments. The ransom money produced the most dramatic physical development of the entire case. On the 10th of February, 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family along the north bank of the Columbia River near Tena Bar, a sandy beach approximately 9 miles southwest of Vancouver, Washington. While digging in the sand, he unearthed 3 deteriorated packets of $20 bills. The bills were water-damaged, decayed, and partially disintegrated, but the serial numbers were legible. The FBI confirmed they matched the ransom, $5,800 in bills, still held together by the rubber bands from the original bank packets, had been resting in that sand for nearly a decade. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. The Tena Bar location was not consistent with the FBI's calculated drop zone. It was south and west of where Cooper should have landed. Hydrologists and geologists were brought in to analyze the site. The sand layers at Tena Bar were studied in an attempt to determine when the bills had been deposited. The analysis suggested the money had arrived sometime after 1974, which implied it may have washed downstream from another location, rather than being dropped directly there. But the river's behavior over 9 years made definitive conclusions impossible. The Tena Bar find remains the only physical evidence ever recovered from the hijacking that was not found on the aircraft itself. Investigators pursued hundreds of suspects over the following decades. The list of individuals seriously considered by the FBI grew into the thousands. Several men were investigated at length, a Vietnam-era paratrooper named Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr., who hijacked a United Airlines flight just 5 months after Cooper and made a near-identical ransom jump over Utah, was considered a strong candidate. McCoy was apprehended, convicted, and eventually killed in a prison escape in 1974. His DNA was tested against evidence from the Cooper case. It did not match. A man named Duane Weber, who, on his deathbed in 1995, allegedly told his wife that he was Dan Cooper, was investigated extensively. The FBI examined DNA handwriting and circumstantial details. The evidence was inconclusive. A suspect identified as L.D. Cooper, no relation to the alias, was pursued based on a tip from his niece, who claimed he had confessed to her. DNA from the tie left on the aircraft was compared against samples. The result was inconclusive. The tie itself became one of the most analyzed artifacts in FBI history. It had been forgotten on the seat in the aircraft's rear cabin. Forensic analysts examined it over multiple decades as technology improved. By the 2000s, DNA analysis had advanced to the point where partial profiles could be extracted from very small biological samples. Analysts found cells on the tie consistent with a white male, but the profile was incomplete, too partial to run through national databases with certainty. In 2007, independent researchers announced that they had found rare earth particles on the tie consistent with industrial titanium production, suggesting Cooper may have worked in the aerospace or metals industry. The FBI neither confirmed nor denied the finding, and the tie's chain of custody had become complicated enough by that point that contaminants could not be ruled out. By the 1980s, the NORJAK investigation had become something of an institution at the FBI's Seattle field office. Senior agents who had worked the original case retired and were replaced by younger agents who had grown up reading about Cooper. The file expanded to contain thousands of documents, witness statements, tip reports, and forensic analyses. The active investigation slackened in periods of budget pressure and revived whenever a new tip seemed promising. In 1986, a woman named Clara Abbott claimed her recently deceased ex-husband had confessed to being co-opper before his death. She provided detailed information. Investigators checked it thoroughly and found no corroboration. The case faded from active priority more than once over the decades. Resources shifted to terrorism after 2001. Cold case units were restructured. In July 2016, the FBI officially announced that it was suspending active investigation of the DB Cooper case, citing the need to redirect resources toward other priorities. The announcement was carefully worded. The case was not closed. The investigation was not terminated. It was suspended. The file remained open. The FBI stated it would respond to credible new leads if they emerged. The family of the flight crew members, those who had spent hours in the presence of a man holding a briefcase he claimed was a bomb, had largely stayed out of the public debate over the years. Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who remained in the cabin with Cooper throughout the hijacking, gave a comprehensive statement to the FBI and then largely withdrew from public life. She described a man who was respectful to the crew, who told her not to be afraid, who seemed to feel genuine remorse about putting her through the ordeal. Whether that impression was tactical or sincere, she could not say. The forests of the Pacific Northwest have not given up any further secrets. No parachute has been found. No body has been recovered. No campsite. No buried money. No second cache of bills has ever surfaced. The wilderness between Portland and Seattle, a region of dense Douglas fir, steep river canyons, and logging clearcuts, swallowed whatever evidence remained. If Cooper survived the jump, he had a remarkable combination of skill, luck, and knowledge of the terrain. If he did not, His remains have never been found in more than 50 years of active and passive searching. What can be said with certainty is remarkably little. A man bought a ticket. He made a credible bomb threat. He collected $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He instructed a flight crew in precise and knowledgeable terms. He lowered an air stair at night, in November at 10,000 feet, over remote wilderness. He jumped. He vanished. A small portion of his ransom money appeared on a riverbank 9 years later, partially dissolved, its origins and journey unknown. A partial DNA profile exists on a clip-on tie. A palm print on an air stair has never been matched. The questions that remain are not merely procedural. They go to the heart of what kind of person could do this, and why. Was it desperation? Calculation? Some private war with the system that had produced him? Was he a veteran, a criminal, a loner, a family man who disappeared back into ordinary life? Did he die on the way down, lost in the dark and the rain, tangled in parachute lines above a river? No one was watching. Or did he walk out of those woods and become someone else entirely? Someone who watched the FBI press conferences on a television set somewhere and kept his silence. Half a century of investigation, millions of dollars in federal resources, and thousands of citizen tips have not produced an answer. The man who called himself Dan Cooper remains exactly what he was on the evening of the 24th of November, 1971, a figure disappearing into the dark over the evergreens, leaving behind only a tie and a question.